For Indigenous peoples, the concept of treaty refers to like a broader understanding of relationships. And this broader understanding of relationships of like how you work out stuff together is something which is meant to be flexible, right? And it's meant to be worked out in context and in the day-to-day.
Right.
And so a lot of times when Indigenous peoples refer to treaty, it's not just a reference to these historic documents, but a reference to an idea of how people live well together.
Hey guys, what's happening? Welcome to Your Forest. I'm Matthew Kristoff. On this podcast, we talk about the environment and the science of sustainability. Today's episode is kind of a departure from talking about the environment and sustainability, though, in a way. Today's episode, I thought it would be cool to bring on a friend of mine, actually, a guy I met through hockey, funnily enough, in Canada here. But his name is Matt Wildcat, and he is an assistant professor of Native Studies at the University of Alberta. And I wanted to bring him on to talk about treaties in Canada. The reason being is I think that we don't really understand what a treaty is, what they mean, how they apply to everybody. Like, treaties aren't just for Indigenous folks; they're for everyone, all Canadians, all Indigenous people. It's we're all treaty people is the famous saying, right? And I wanted to bring him on just to talk about it, just to understand it. And even though this isn't directly forestry or environmental management related, I feel like it's good information to have. It's good information to know, and it does provide context for management decisions on the landscape. So I thought it would be a good idea to bring him on and talk about the treaties that were signed in Canada, the history behind them, what they mean, what they're supposed to mean, how they haven't been kept up, and just generally talking about the condition that Indigenous peoples in Canada have had to deal with, right? And how we got here, and maybe have some discussion about how we can fix this, right? The whole point was just to describe this process of treaties and what a treaty is, what it's supposed to be, the mindset of a treaty, and realistically how treaties should be the story we tell ourselves about Canada, of how Canada came to be, and how that's a good thing. That's something to be proud of and something that we should strive towards achieving, right? And it was really, really awesome. I never really thought about it that way. It was a great conversation. Like, we talked so much about so many different things, and Matt's just a wealth of knowledge. I really appreciated him taking the time to come on here to talk about this, because it's just, I feel like it's a conversation that I wanted to have really badly for a long time, and I think a lot of people need to hear it, just so we can all move forward together, understanding what this relationship is between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, and what the treaty means, right? So it was great. Sponsors for this episode are West Fraser. West Fraser is the number one sponsor for 2020. Without them, this wouldn't be possible. They make it possible for me to, do all of this cool stuff and get it out there for people to listen to, and I really appreciate all of their support. Greenlink Forestry is another sponsor. Again, wouldn't be possible without them. Thank you so much, Greenlink. And also Damaged Timber. Damaged Timber is a company out of Edmonton here, and their staple product right now is they're making stuff out of damaged timber. So you can get butcher blocks, cutting boards, charcuterie boards out of wood from wildfires in Alberta. So he's actually going out and cutting down wildfire burnt wood and turning it into stuff you can put in your kitchen. It's awesome. Check them out. Just this conversation doesn't represent the sponsors in any way. This is just a conversation between me and a friend about treaties and stuff that we find interesting. So it was a great conversation. Lots to learn, lots I didn't know about. I hope you guys like it. Without any further messing around, let's dive into it. Here's Matt and I talking about treaties. thought a good place to start was we'll be just talking about like how you got into the role that you're in, right? Like, so what made you get into this role? Like, first of all, just talk about what you do, and what pushed you to go that direction.
Yeah. So I'm an assistant professor of political science and Native studies at the University of Alberta, and my specialization is Indigenous governance, like broadly conceived, and that involves a whole bunch of things. I think part of it is it involves like an understanding of our political histories, talking about Indigenous political thought, and then in particular, I'm interested in how Indigenous peoples govern today, and part of that obviously involves our relationship with Canadian society, right?
Yeah.
So those are kind of the most widely conceived, all the things that I'm interested in. So interestingly enough, when I started university, I started in engineering.
Okay.
Which of course is like, every parent's dream in rural Alberta for their kid to go into first year engineering at U of A, right?
There's a lot of dropouts in that first year. I know quite a few.
That's right.
One of my buddies, he dropped out after a month.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So
that's not for me. I was like, that's fair. It wasn't for me either.
Yeah. So, that was my inclination when I was in high school, was math and sciences. When I went into engineering, I wasn't, the school I wasn't, particularly motivated or passionate about. But where I switched was I went and worked in Syncrude for a summer as a summer student.
Yeah.
And when I was up there was this this moment when I was looking at like all the a map of all the claims that oil sands companies had on the different areas that they would mine, and right in the middle of it was Fort Mackay First Nation. And I just thought at that moment, like, this is a huge project. It's a huge beast in some sort of ways. And I think up to that point I'd always thought, but you know what, there's an opportunity for me as an engineer to make an impact for Indigenous peoples, right?
Yeah, totally.
And I think in that moment I felt very small, and I thought, you know what, if my main concern is that I want to help Indigenous peoples in some sort of way, then I should go do what I want to do. And then so I switched into Native studies that summer,
right.
And I don't think my mom was super pleased about it at first.
Really?
Yeah. But then
it doesn't seem like there's a future there, right? Like there's no direct path to success.
Absolutely not. Yeah. But you fast forward a dozen years from this is in the summer of 2003. You fast forward a dozen years, and all of a sudden, Indigenous professors are some of the most sought out professionals in the country.
You saw the future coming. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely didn't do it for the job prospects, but it certainly helped out. It turned out pretty good from that standpoint. But for me, it was always like I wanted to do something that would help Indigenous peoples, help the community that I'm from, like Ermineskin Cree Nation, which is one of the 4 First Nations in Musquechies, and so that was always my inclination. I didn't know how that was gonna, when I left engineering, I wasn't sure exactly how that was gonna play out. I just knew that I wanted to study something different in school.
Yeah, you felt that pull to a different direction.
Yeah, absolutely. And as it, there's probably a good chance I would have gone into law school. But, I went, this is a funny story. He's now the Dean of Native Studies at the University of Alberta, Chris Anderson. And I went and played squash with him one day. He was always looking for squash partners. Yeah. And so when we were playing squash,
And you were a student at the time.
I was a student at the time, yeah. But, he wasn't that much older than me. He's probably only like 7 or 8 years older than me. And so when we were playing squash, and I was telling him about my plans to try to apply for law school, and he said, "Don't apply for law school. There's already enough, First Nations lawyers. We need more. We need more people who are professors." He said, "You should go to grad school." And I was impressionable at the time, and so I did that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's awesome. So like your upbringing too, like you said, you grew up in Musquecheese, and like, so what was that like for you, and what did that, like, looking backwards, how do you think that shaped your focus, like your professional focus today?
Yeah. So for me, I think growing up on reserve was super valuable because you pick up so much information, but also you live in a context that is like, constantly politicized, I would say, in a way. So people are always talking about politics. And often for me, my family was often talking about the politics of the reserve, like, and in particular, how do you improve the nation? Like, how do you improve how Ermineskin Cree Nation is run?
How do you say that?
Ermineskin Cree Nation.
That's the nation you're from. Okay.
Yeah. And so, for me, those conversations were just like, ever present, ubiquitous, right? And so,
so not so much like, I mean, I'm sure you guys talked about provincial and federal politics as well, but there's a lot of local politics.
There's a lot of local politics. And obviously when you talk about First Nations politics, your relationship with Canadian society is ever present, right? So, and this is funnily enough, something Chris Anderson says, when you're Indigenous, you have no choice but to be well-versed in what Canadian society is and how it impacts you. But when you're non-Indigenous, you can often ignore Indigenous peoples. You don't have to have a good sense of who they are,
right,
what your relationship with them is. Obviously we come into conflict like Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people.
Perfect example right now is the oh God, I forget their name now.
The Mi'kmaq out in
Mi'kmaq in
Nova Scotia, in the fishery.
Right,
yeah, no, it's
crazy,
but that's a long-standing, like, that it seems spectacular in some ways, like, having this Mi'kmaq.
Is that how you say it? I thought it was Mi'kmaq, but okay. Mi'kmaq,
yeah, I think it's Mi'kmaq is correct. I'm pretty sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll believe you on that one.
Yeah.
Every other source that I've read has been definitely from a white context. So.
Yeah. So it seems spectacular, right? Seeing this like Mi'kmaq lobster warehouse lit on fire.
Yeah. The spike strips. I saw there was a bunch of fishermen putting spike strips down.
And so, but these things I think are always kind of bubbling under the surface, but then sometimes they erupt, right? And I think we can probably actually characterize a lot of relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in this country as, there's always these kind of like tensions that exist. And then sometimes they erupt into these spectacular events. And then when the spectacular events happen, we want to think like, this seems ridiculous. Like, where did this all come from? But it's just like sometimes it boils over, right?
Yeah. And these are tensions that happen from like, since they've been rising since colonization, really, since these two societies have like come together, right?
That's
like,
right. Yeah.
So this is going on for hundreds of years that we've been, and like, yeah, it's weird to even like, I find it strange to even have to talk about it sometimes because it's so uncomfortable, right? We want to imagine that like, no, like this is Western society. Like everyone prospers. We're doing really well. Like, we have democracy, we have free markets, we have this, we have that. And it just seems like, oh, we're doing pretty good. Like we should be happy. And it's like, well, the truth is some people aren't. And disproportionately so Indigenous folks in Canada really are not, right?
Yeah.
Like it's a hard go. And like you said, we've been, I'm a perfect example. I've been fortunate enough to be able to, I could go through my entire life and never know anything about Indigenous folks, and it probably wouldn't really affect me.
Mm-hmm.
But like you said, like Indigenous folks need to understand all of that just to be able to operate at all, because there's different rules, there's different restrictions, and there's the whole, the shame that's been created around that. You know what I mean? Around that culture as well. So it's just it's weird to have to even talk about it, right? Because you don't want to admit that it exists. Yeah. Right.
Well, and part of the, the power balance between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people's country is that, for Indigenous peoples, when we have to negotiate and talk through issues of conflict and, we're often forced to do so on the terms set out by non-Indigenous people, right? And what I mean by that is, we have to do it on the basis of Canadian law. We have to do it on the basis of, kind of like very entrenched, and these ideas are typically so entrenched that they're taken for granted, right?
Yeah.
But ideas of like, what is the individual and like individual rights, equality before the law, rule of law. These are all terms that we hear getting tossed around when we try to work through these difficult concepts, right? Or these difficult conflicts that people have. But what people don't understand is when we are forced to use those terms, we're using terms that are already kind of like tilted towards tilted in favor of non-Indigenous peoples in terms of how we figure this stuff out. And so a concept like treaty, I think, is probably one of our most important. Is probably really something that should be a touchstone for more people in Canadian society, because at least at some respects, what it does is it tilts our understandings back towards Indigenous people's own understandings of concepts like justice, law, fairness. And so that's why I think it's such an interesting concept, actually.
Totally. Well, that's why we're all here today, right? Like the whole concept of treaties and like, what the hell is a treaty really? Like I'm sure you have a very good understanding of it, right? But I think, and I imagine most Indigenous folks understand the full history of the context and the treaties and all that. But like, I can honestly say that I grew up in Northern Alberta, right? Amongst like lots of Indigenous folks. And I was able to come through that without really knowing anything about treaties, right? Besides like the stuff, they're exempt from taxes and they get all kinds of money from the government and this kind of stuff, right? And you're like, I don't even know if any of that's true, right? At the time, it's just the stereotypes you hear being in a northern town, right? And so I want to start by talking about exactly let's talk about like what a treaty is and try to provide some real factual context for what that is going into this, and then so we can try to dissuade some of these stereotypes and some of this misunderstanding, because that's all of this combativeness it's all comes from misunderstanding, right? Like different perspectives because of I would say mostly ignorance on the part of white folks and stuff like that, right? Like settler folks, like we don't know. So we need to know in order to have like an actual conversation that's functional. Yeah.
When you're talking, it actually reminds me of an interview I did with Roger Epp last year for one of my classes. And when he talks about treaty, one of the things he says is a lot of times non-Indigenous people think treaty is just like benefits that Indigenous people get, right?
That's right.
And it's not an understanding of treaty as a two-way relationship, because, the huge part of treaty is that non-Indigenous people get to live here in Canada, right? And that's what treaties allow for, is they allow for the creation of Canada, right? And so, it's more pertinent to what people often call the number treaty. So this is treaties 1 through 12. And so, for instance, where you grew up in Treaty 8 in Slave Lake, this is part of the numbered treaty area, right? And so is almost the entirety of the Prairie provinces are covered by the numbered treaties. And then, parts of BC and Northern Canada and Ontario are also covered by the numbered treaties.
Right.
But, there's a very specific understanding of treaties amongst Indigenous people who signed the numbered treaties. And so, it's these benefits are seen, I think, from Indigenous peoples, a lot of times these benefits are seen as these should be small prices to pay for the ability to live in Canada, to benefit from all of the resources, and for and this is the terms of a two-way agreement, right, or a two-way relationship. So I think, though, it's also a difficult concept to understand sometimes, because treaties refer to actual historic agreements. But for Indigenous peoples, the concept of treaty refers to a broader understanding of relationships, and this broader understanding of relationships of how you work out stuff together is something which is meant to be flexible, right? And it's meant to be worked out in context and in the day to day.
Right.
And so a lot of times when Indigenous peoples refer to treaty, it's not just a reference to these historic documents, but a reference to an idea of how people live well together.
Yeah.
Right. And so that living well together is what I tend to think about when I think about treaty.
Right.
Because that's what we have to figure out today. but they also refer to historic documents. So, so historically, Treaty 8 through 12 were signed a little bit later on. They were signed from 1899, and I believe Treaty 12 was signed in 1923.
Okay.
And those treaties are signed in more, remote areas of Canada. Were often opened up for the purposes of mining, and whereas treaties 1 through 7 were primarily signed for the purposes of opening up agricultural settlement on behalf of non-Indigenous peoples, right?
Okay.
And in particular, the ability to build a railroad because of non-agricultural settlement. So
okay. So let's back up just a little bit. So the idea of treaties, like from the understanding of Indigenous folks, was from this idea of like we were two nations, like two sovereign nations. They're coming together to agreements so we can live, like learn to work and live together on this place that we call Canada now, right? And so going into the signing of those treaties, can we like let's I would like to paint a picture of like the two different groups going into these treaties, the two different perceived intentions, or maybe you have like factual like proof of the intentions going in and the ideas that you can discuss, and kind of what they came out with, what was the understanding they came out of that area with, like with that signing of the treaty with. Absolutely.
Yeah. So, I think, when I talk about like treaties are what like gave birth to Canada, I think one of the ways in which why that should be important to everyone is because if that's not the story that lies at the root of Canada as a legitimate country, then the other story that we have to tell is one of conquest. Right. But really, there wasn't really a lot of conquest in Canada. Like, yes, there was the Riel Rebellion, but that happened after treaties were signed, actually. And it's not really, there wasn't a, kind of a formal, there was never ever a formal effort on the part of Canada to like achieve its sovereignty through conquest.
Not like the States where it was like,
Yeah, but even in the States, typically, they're what are often referred to as the Indian Wars down there, which, antiquated term, but
we got it still too. Yeah.
Even those typically occur after treaties. So even in the States, in the States, there's like over 600 treaties between the United States and Indigenous nations. And usually conflict happens after the treaties. Often the conflict happens because the treaties aren't being fulfilled, right? And so even in the States, there's little ability to tell a story which is based purely on conquest either, although they did fight militarily a lot more than it happened up here.
Yeah, there was a bit of that going on.
A good amount of it, yeah. But, so the tricky part is that if it's not based on treaties, it's not based on conquest, then the story Canada has to tell is this story based on the doctrine of discovery, which is that Canada exists because when Europeans showed up, they automatically gained title to land because
this is ours.
They were, yes, exactly, right. And this is where and we actually have lots of symbols which show that Europeans showing up and planting a flag, right?
Yeah.
And that is just like, it's not even trying to hide its racism. It's just explicitly racist. We get this land because we're European, we're white, and
we got it.
We're superior, we're better than other people, right? Like this is like the definition of racism, right?
Sure.
So this is not the story that I think Canada wants to tell about its foundations or origins either. But unfortunately, without treaties, that's the story Canada has to tell, right? And in fact, in some parts of the country, that's the only story Canada can tell right now. We're actually lucky enough in a place like Alberta to be able to say, we can actually talk about treaties as the foundation of a legitimate society, right?
And most people don't I say most people, most non-Indigenous folks don't see treaties as the foundation or a foundation of Canada, right? Mm-hmm. They see it as this thing off to the side that like, just don't think about it, don't worry about it. Yeah. So it's like, and I don't mean that as like being offensive to non-Indigenous folks. I just mean like, it's not on our radar for the most part, right?
Yeah.
So it's like that right there is even just like a huge discrepancy in how we view this, right? So
Yes.
I want to talk about all of this misconception and all this. So yeah, keep going about treaties and how that's the foundation of what we got going on.
So it's interesting. A recent this is a legal political history by a scholar named Peter Russell. He says Canada is a country of incomplete conquests. And it was, that's, again, like it's literally, that's not the story Canada can tell is, it's like there was British people never were able to like fully achieve a conquest over other, not only Indigenous, but people in Quebec as well. Right. And so, but I think what he says is, it's not the worst thing, because what it allows us, or what it should give us, is the foundation to try to work out relationships in the present, in the day-to-day, right? Yeah. All this being said, though, there is like a historical background of treaties. And so, out here in the Prairie provinces, this was at one point called Rupert's Land. Yep. And the reason it was called Rupert's Land was it was all the territory draining into the Hudson's Bay, and it was Rupert's Land because it was claimed by Prince Rupert,
right?
Through a discovery claim, right? So this is like the doctrine of discovery was an actual law between nations in Europe of how they would recognize each other's claims to non-European lands, right? And so,
isn't it amazing that you could just imagine that, like, Canada right now, we were just like sailing off into some ocean. We're like, we find this massive land. We're like, hey guys, this is ours. We got it. Like, this belongs to us now. And you're like, wait, hold on 1 second here. Like, yeah, like it's amazing that like the disconnect there, right? But anyways, continuing.
And I think, I would have to go look it up, but I'm quite certain in this instance, it didn't even involve setting foot on land. It was a voyage by Henry Hudson, and I think it was 1611 or so, where he just sailed through Hudson's Bay, and then he said, all the lands draining into this bay I claim on behalf of Britain. And
let me just claim a third of North America. It's ours. Yeah.
Of course, it took almost like 250 years for Britain to have effective control in the lands draining into Hudson's Bay, because really Canada didn't gain effective control in the Prairie provinces until the late 1800s at the very minimum.
Sure.
And in parts of northern Canada, it was actually not well into the 1900s where Canada was able to gain effective control over territory. But in 1869, as 2 years after Canada becomes a nation, one of the things that happens is that it looks to expand. And so what it does is it makes an agreement with the Hudson's Bay Company, which owns the original charter issued by the King of England.
That's another bananas thing. The fact that like literally 2/3 of Canada was owned by a company. You're like, well, what? Up until 135 years ago. Yeah.
And, so that charter granted to the Hudson's Bay Company, they held title based on a claim of discovery, right? Mm. And so Canada went and bought that claim of discovery off of the Hudson's Bay in 1869. Yeah. And so Indigenous peoples hear of this transaction and say, hold on a second, what's going on here? Like this Hudson's Bay Company, this was not yours to sell. And in fact, as far as we know, you're just a couple thousand people at most at any given time, mostly congregated around a few forts within our territory. Like we're still the rulers of this, of this land. Like, and while the history of the fur trade, obviously involves all sorts of, people might say deceit, or that, there might have been, sometimes Indigenous peoples may have been taken advantage of in the fur trade. There's also still benefits that Indigenous peoples get from the fur trade. But more particularly, the Hudson's Bay Company also relies on Indigenous peoples as well in this relationship. There has to be a partnership
for a long time.
Yeah. And in particular to eat, like the only way that people at the forts are eating often is that Indigenous peoples are selling them food that they've harvested themselves. Right?
Oh yeah, completely dependent on them to a lot of parts. Yeah.
But of course, with Canada, this relationship starts to change, right? Because rather than a partnership, which is really in many ways built on Indigenous economies Indigenous, transport systems. Canada, with settlement, comes to impose its own, systems of transportation, communication, supply chains, all of those over Indigenous territories, right? And it dramatically alters the relationship of power.
Totally.
And so, that was a bit of an aside, but
that's okay.
But just to distinguish what's different between the Hudson's Bay Company and Canada, right?
Yep, for sure.
And so with Hudson's Bay Company sells its discovery claim to Canada in 1869. Indigenous peoples hear about it and say, if you're going to come into this territory, you have to deal with us. Like, you can't just deal with the Hudson's Bay. And so the number treaties start getting signed only 2 years later in 1871. That's treaty number 1. And then Canada signs one every year for the next 7 years until 1877, when it signs Treaty 7, and then has a small break. After that. But this is dealing primarily with what they would call like the fertile, like agricultural belt.
Right.
Where agriculture would be taking place. And that's where, if you go look at a map of treaties 1 through 7, you'll say, okay, that's, this
prime
is
settler territory.
Yes, this is clearly where all the farming's taking place, right? And so when Canada comes to deal with Indigenous peoples over these treaties, there is an agreement that they're dealing about land, but each side's understanding of it looks very different. And so for Indigenous peoples, there's an understanding that, there is notions of property and ownership, but not as sedimented as you would find in a British tradition at that time.
Okay.
Right. And so there's an idea that we'll share land. So reserves are what we have left over, but also we retain rights to hunting and to movement over the rest of our territories. And also, most people's understanding of the treaties is we'll retain mineral rights as well under the land, because this deal is just about agriculture.
At that point, they were even like thinking about mineral rights and that kind of stuff, and like below the ground.
That's right.
Resources.
Yeah.
So what were I suppose? Hey, they would have mines, and they would have for whatever. Yeah, I guess. Okay.
Like, I think by that point, there's an understanding of coal at some extent as well.
Right.
Of its
Indigenous folks would have too.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And so, but also it's an understanding that, this is territory that we'll share together.
Sure.
Right. And we'll have to work out what that sharing looks like.
Okay.
Over time. And as part of this sharing, there's certain benefits that we accrue from this. So these are what people would call treaty rates.
So
today,
just before we continue on, so going into this wasn't like a Canada going to Indigenous folks being like, "Hey, sign this thing or else." It was more like two nations coming together, being like, "Hey, we're going to be here. Let's learn to live together and come to some kind of agreement where we can compromise and work something out."
Yeah.
Right.
So by this point, Indigenous peoples would be well aware that European expansion was taking place I think in lots of parts of the world, but in particular in the States, right? Like Indigenous peoples in what become the Canadian prairies are well aware that, that there is an expansion.
There's a potential for conflict. Okay.
And then there's also a growing awareness of this kind of, what by that point is a very clear like ecological disaster of like bison herds collapsing, right? And so this is also being the primary economy, like the pillar of like Indigenous economies.
Oh, right, because everything, their whole fur trade, everything was based off of the bison, all that kind of stuff. And if they're down to 1,000 by the end of the end of the 1880s, there's only like 1,000 left in all of North America, really. So it's like that's versus whatever it was, like 30 million or something at one point. So
like bison was a huge part of the fur trade, but primarily for food, actually.
Of course.
The furs themselves became very important to industrial development prior to the invention of rubber,
right?
Because bison hides were much stronger. Like bison leather was super strong and was required for drive belts. Actually, in a lot of industrial expansion, in particular in the eastern United States, and so that was actually one of the causes, right, of this overhunting. But then also, many people say that there was an explicit attempt on the part of the American government to exterminate bison herds. Once there was like kind of, an alternate.
Yeah, and there's evidence of that too. There's letters that go back and forth between governing bodies and stuff, and all kinds of get rid of the Indian problem thing. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah. So,
I guess actually just for context for people. So let me get this straight. So we're kind of talking about like Indigenous people have been living on this land for thousands of years, kind of living with it, whatever, and then. Settlers come in, the landscape starts to change, and so their ability to live off the landscape and you know what I mean is starting to be diminished through lots of things, but one of the main things is the loss of bison herds, right? Mm-hmm. So then they have to start to seek new ways of living, I guess. Right. So then they start to become part of the economy because this kind of have no choice at this point to start to follow into the Western way of doing things.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
So treaties were meant to allow for a transition to agriculture on behalf of Indigenous peoples. And if you go read the actual text of the treaties, a lot of it has to do with the agricultural implements that you would get. In fact. Yeah. And so this was, so for Indigenous peoples, there's obviously Indigenous peoples are signing treaties under duress in a lot of ways. And, we often say that, the validity of contracts is questionable if they're signed under duress, right?
Yeah, no kidding.
But also it's people being strategic and trying to look to the future as well, right? And so I don't think that entirely disqualifies the validity of treaties. And also, Indigenous peoples continue to point to treaties as something which we should uphold.
Yeah, they like the idea of the treaties as it was like, as it was understood at the time, right? But it's the interpretation has been altered. So
that's right.
So going into signing these treaties, let's say like treaty number 1 or whatever, any treaty, pick whatever one you want. Going into signing these treaties, the concept of signing something, or the concept of legality, or the concept of like even like I said before we started, reading, like even being able to speak or read English, like are these concepts that are understood, or is this just like what is the Indigenous mindset going into these conversations?
So there wouldn't have been too many Indigenous peoples who would have spoke English at the time. Very few. In fact, there was far more white people who spoke Cree than there was Cree people who spoke English.
Okay.
At that time, and actually, I've heard stories of the shopkeepers in Musquechees, like the non-native shopkeepers. They spoke Cree up until the 1950s. Oh. In fact, it was just, that was the lingua franca of the area, right?
Yeah.
And so so there was a lack of understanding on that part, but also Indigenous peoples brought interpreters. And there's kind of varying degrees of interpretation of how well the interpreters work. So in Treaty 6, for instance, the interpreter was a guy by the name of Peter Erasmus, who there's a fascinating book about him that it's like an as told to book. So he explained this book to an author, and then the author transcribed it and wrote it down. It's called Buffalo Days and Nights. And it's a really cool book because it gives a real sense of what life was like back then, at least for this, for Peter Erasmus. Yep. And many people today consider himself Métis, but interestingly enough, in the book, he never identifies as anything really. He's just like a guy living on the prairies.
Oh, okay.
So and he has Indigenous ancestry, but he lives with multiple groups of people, right? And so sometimes he lives in.
He's not culturally explicit with anybody.
No, he lives in Métis communities at the time. Mm-hmm. He also lives in First Nations community, like Cree communities, and sometimes he. Has relationships primarily with white people as well. And so it's actually interesting when I read the book because I was like, what is this guy even? And so it's like,
whose side are you on?
Yeah. So, but he could speak Cree and English fluently.
Okay.
And so there's good reason to believe that there was some level of understanding, but of course at a certain level, there's just difference in not only just worldviews, but like your understanding of what certain political concepts mean, right? Because, as humans, so much of what we understand it's kind of like below the surface, right? It's like implicit. It's just kind of there.
Sure.
And we don't necessarily articulate it or like make explicit every single thing we mean. but when you share a language with somebody, you develop all those common understandings, right, over time. And so, one of the stories, this is a professor at U of A, James Dempsey, he uses to illustrate this divide is, so after the Real resistance in 1885, one of the things that happens is a Cree chief, Big Bear, is charged with treason. And when he's charged with treason, the interpreter is telling him in Cree, you've been charged with stealing the Queen's hat. And Big Bear is incredulous, and he says, why would I possibly try to steal the Queen's hat? I did not even know that she had a hat, right? But it's like, it's what's being interpreted to him is like, this is a crime against the crown, right? Like the Queen of England, right?
Yeah.
And so these
man.
There was an ability to communicate somewhat, but also there would have been difficulties as well. And so you can see why something like this disagreement, on the part of the crown, treaties are meant to purchase land, to, they have terms like cede, release, and surrender.
Forever.
And so they're supposed, they're thought of as being land sales. And you can see how Indigenous peoples, there's, okay, wait, like we're going to share the land, right? Because you're just coming at it from like two different, from traditions that just have kind of like different implicit understandings.
I was saying, do Indigenous folks at this time really, like, I'm sure they understand the concept of property, but like, is that concept of property, is it as like ingrained in their society as European culture, right? Like, this is mine, it belongs to me, like, kind of thing? Or is it like, I feel like Indigenous culture was more like communal and like, we're like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Is that true? Or?
Like people would have absolutely had some understanding of like, this is land that I use.
Right.
And it's not that I'm the only person who can use this land, but if you're going to use it, you should come talk to me.
Sure. Like, hey, we should work out something so we're not stepping on each other's toes.
That's right. Yeah. But it wasn't, there was the idea of like drawing boundaries or like land surveys.
You stay off my land. I'll stay off. Yeah. Like that, none of that stuff. But actually going back just a second, thinking about like legal documents, like I remember reading through and like listening to interpretations of how the treaties themselves, how they're written. I think I listened to a documentary and they were reading out Treaty 9 wordage, right? Mm-hmm. And it was like, even for me today, it's difficult for me to understand what exactly the hell are like there's a reason we have lawyers, right? Yeah. Because like you can't read a legal document and be like, oh, I understand this completely, because most of the words is like hither now and for unto then and like shit like that. And you're like, even a person who speaks perfectly good English doesn't know what the hell they're talking about. Uh-huh. So how is someone who speaks Cree and is having that being interpreted to them, like how are they supposed to understand that concept? So just, the lost by interpretation kind of thing, right? Like, it's not like just because those words have been translated doesn't mean, like, I'm sure Cree doesn't have a word for most of the stuff. Like you said, the crown, like they probably don't have a word for crown. Yeah. So he said hat. And it's like, how the hell is he supposed to know what that means? There's no context there, right? Yeah. So it's like, it's almost like, to me, it almost seems like there was no real chance or opportunity for Indigenous folks to really understand what they were signing, what they were doing. Is that fair to say, or am I being over?
It's tough to say because the histories on all this are
he said, she
said.
It's
still an open question a little bit, right? Okay. And to what extent people would have had understanding. So there's lots of good history textbooks, and I think the biggest thing is that there probably was an opportunity for understanding, but an opportunity for understanding has to be made between two parties who are, really truly trying to make an agreement with each other, right? And so, while there was clearly a high interest on the part of Indigenous peoples to make an agreement which would allow for new life, right? That transition to farming,
because there was some struggle at that time. They couldn't follow their normal, so there was some desire to like, hey, we would like to prosper again, and this will be good for us. This will help our communities, help our culture.
That's right. Okay. So, there was much less incentive and motivation on the part of the Canadian government to make an agreement which would allow for two people to live together.
Sure.
Right. And so, for instance, the starkest example of this is probably in Treaty 6, where we are today, is, signed in 1876. That's the same year that the Indian Act is created as well.
Right.
What is the purpose of the Indian Act? It's to enfranchise Native people so that slowly over time, all Native people will become, quote unquote, like full Canadian citizens, will no longer have the rights of Indian status, and then the what people would have called it, the so-called Indian problem, like would gradually disappear as Indigenous people became assimilated into Canadian society, right?
Yeah.
So we now know that this was a complete failure of a policy, and that like very few people ever enfranchised. But you can see that, there were, on the part of the government of Canada signing this document over, over land at that time, there wasn't really an anticipation that what it was going to lead to was a long-term relationship between Indigenous peoples in Canada.
Respect, we'll sign this thing, they'll become us, and we'll continue to do what we want to do.
And
so just a complete misunderstanding by both parts of what this agreement means, really. Like,
yeah, absolutely. And, and so, but also, one of the things that would inhibit coming to an agreement is that there's a common vision of what the agreement is supposed to ensure moving into the future, right?
Yeah.
And on the part of Canada, there was no motivation or no thought that this agreement would create a relationship that is to last.
Sure. Okay.
Right. And so to me, that's probably the bigger piece rather than an inability for the two groups to understand each other.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So treaties weren't supposed to be something we're talking about today.
No, absolutely not.
To the Canadian government. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So I think that's probably also too why the Canadian government was, willing to kind of like have language like, as long as like the sun shines and the rivers flow, and
Right.
or I don't think that language is often included in the treaties, but those are things that are like the historical record very clearly shows. Treaty negotiators on behalf of the government of Canada use language like that. Absolutely, like that is like fairly uncontroversial.
Right.
But for them, they're like, they're like saying stuff like that, but then in the back of their mind, they're thinking that's these treaties won't last forever because Indigenous people aren't going to last forever.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
So now that we kind of painted that picture, so what happens after the signing of the treaties? Like, how does that change the way Indigenous people can live? Like, obviously with the treaties came the formulation of reserves and stuff too, right? That was around this. That was part of the treaty, or was that a separate thing?
Reserves are part of treaties. Yeah,
they're part of the treaties. Okay, yeah. So after the signing happens and they, both groups kind of go their separate ways and go about their lives. However, how long is it until Indigenous folks realize that, like, oh shit, this isn't what we thought it was?
It probably very soon after. Yeah, like okay. Almost immediately. I would suggest. Yeah, and so again, on like in Treaty 6, you have the Riel resistance in 1885. This is only 9 years after the signing of Treaty 6. And of course, the Riel resistance in many ways was revolved around Métis struggles, but not entirely. It was a general discontent. And so, one of the ways in which you can think about that is you have this like old order, this Indigenous order, where there's kind of like multiple Indigenous actors involved. So like you have Métis people, Cree, Assiniboine, and Saulteaux. And then, like Blackfoot and Southern Alberta, obviously. And so this old order is coming into confrontation with this new order, the Canadian order, that's trying to get set up. And so even though it is Riel was Métis and it was led by Métis people, it also is indicative of a larger discontent that had happened at that time, because by that point, people already feel that treaties aren't being lived up to. And right. if you look at the terms of the agreement, they're absolutely not being lived up to. So
okay. Let's describe it. Let's talk about exactly like what what wasn't lived up to, like legally speaking, even like from the Canadians' perspective, what did they not do that they were supposed to do, even from their perspective? And then I'd like to talk about how I'm assuming that the Indigenous condition kind of declined post treaties. Like things started getting really bad after that, right? Where they were supposed to get better, they were supposed to prosper. And so let's describe how that created that situation, like up until today, even, right? Like why the situation that we're in now, where you know, reserves are largely failing their people, and like there's just a lot of conflict. There's a lot of cultural shame, you know what I mean, around being Indigenous for a lot of people and that kind of stuff. So let's I just want to talk about how we got to where we are today, right? Like this is what this is all about. How do we get to here? So after the treaties, what's kind of the step-by-step process towards like getting to where we are now?
Yeah. So I think to everyone's surprise, buffalo herds went down way faster than everyone thought they were going to. Yeah, and I think most people thought that.
You said Treaty 1 was signed when? 69?
1871.
Or sorry, 1871. So yeah, because I think the huge, I think the big push of the bison fur trade was just starting just a couple years before that. I think there was like a 12-year period where they killed, like, I can't remember. It was like 10 million bison died in like 12 years in the plains. Yeah. And it ended around 1880 something or other. So it was right at the beginning of this massive exodus of bison.
Right. Yeah. And so it happened way quicker than everyone thought it was going to. And, you know, what it did is it created a economic hardship that was, you know, unparalleled, I guess, right? Yeah. And so, you know, so one of the big stipulations of the treaties that, and when Canadian negotiators came, they had a template, but they were altered. The terms of the treaties were altered through the course of negotiations. Okay. And so one of the big things that Indigenous negotiators insisted on was a famine and pestilence clause. And that's, you know, in times of famine, that the Canadian government would be able and willing to provide food so people didn't starve, right? And so, and this is, you know, of course, the treaty negotiators talk about, you know, the Queen is rich enough that she will be able to take care of, you know, all of her children in any parts of the world, right? Right. Kind of using language like that. Okay. And so, you know, the big one right after the treaties are signed is that there actually is famines that arise. Right. But that the Canadian government doesn't provide foodstuffs, even though it often has the ability to. Sure. And even sometimes in some cases you have instances where you have food in storehouses and it's going rotten and no one is eating it because of, really often it's because of the stubbornness of different Indian agents on the prairies who are refusing to provide food. It
still comes down to people in the end.
Yeah. And so, and you know, this was done for all sorts of reasons, but you know, often it was just like cruelty, and then sometimes I think there was racism involved as well, with these decisions not to live up to that treaty negotiation or like that treaty obligation.
Yeah. Right? And this is stuff that's been proven, right? Like, this is not just like hearsay. It's not just your opinion. This is stuff that's like, no, we have this document.
So it was documented in an amazing way by an author named James Dashtuck, who I think was at the University of Saskatchewan. And his book is called Clearing the Plains. And this was actually a national bestseller. And he really you know, it was kind of well known about that there was this kind of, you know, awful period on the prairies where people were starving, but he really went and did the archival work to really just like map it out, what took place during those years. Okay. Yeah. And then of course it's, you know, it's not only starvation, but of course there's all sorts of other diseases that when people are malnourished that arise as well, right? Sure. And so you know, these are very, very difficult times for people.
I was reading something that was saying that the regulations around farming and agriculture for settlers and Indigenous folks were different, and that there were stricter regulations on Indigenous people than there was on settlers. So like if there was a famine, Indigenous people would be the last ones able to like do something about it kind of thing. Is that true, or is that unfair to say?
You might be referring to a little bit later down the history. So, obviously Indigenous peoples rebound eventually and often and many times actually get farming up and running and are quite successful at it. And so there's a couple different policies implemented by the Department of Indian Affairs, which really undercut Indigenous people. So one is Indigenous peoples aren't able to sell their goods on the market like everyone else, but have to receive permission from Indian agents. And of course, you have white farmers in the area who are lobbying the government of Canada to not let Indigenous peoples compete with them on the open market.
Right.
And so that there's not another competitor that exists.
It's not like they've all of a sudden got like equal opportunity to like, hey, you can join the market. It's like, no, we're still seen as another entity. We're not just people, we're Indigenous people. And,
That's right.
Therefore we have less rights or whatever.
Yeah.
I don't know.
And so this is really well documented in a book called Lost Harvests by Sarah Carter. It's quite an old book now, actually. It's from early 1990s.
Okay.
And it's a really interesting book because she says, she kind of gives what she thought her hypothesis going into the research was going to be. She's like, when I went into the research, I figured the Indigenous or Indian farming policy, she calls it in her book, I thought wrong place, wrong time. It just, was bound for failure from the start. But then when she goes and does the research, she sees all of these efforts that were made by government officials to undercut Indigenous peoples to become successful farmers, and for farming on reserves to be an economically viable venture.
Right.
And so that's the one big piece of it. The other big piece, which is kind of maybe shocking for people now, is that within Canada and the United States and this is very common in all of the British settler colonies, is you have this very strong idea that people are ranked along a ladder of civilization, and right. So British modernity is at the top. Basically, other Europeans are very close by. And then everyone else kind of moves down based on different characteristics. And so, especially for nomadic groups, people who are mobile on the prairies, you were considered to be, kind of at the bottom of the ladder of civilization. And so when people started to farm, there was a Canadian policy which prevented them from having the most current farm equipment.
What?
Even though you could have it, because it was said, well, because you're too primitive, you have to use more primitive farm equipment.
Oh my God.
And so this was actual policy and part of the Canadian government, is that Indigenous peoples had to use older technology when farming for many decades before, this went away. And, so not only are Indigenous peoples successful with farming, but they're shackled by having to use older technologies. And, this is, and this is often, farming equipment was guaranteed to people in the treaties, right? Like this was part of the agreement, land agreement. And then also, when you are successful, you can't sell your goods on the market in the same way other people can. So, these are
just a lot of extra hoops, and just restrictions, direct restrictions, not even hoops, just like before you even get into this, like, okay, we're not giving a fair rub. Yeah,
that's right.
It's weird.
Yeah. And so actually, it's, speaking of a forestry podcast, I think there was even a very similar thing that happened in southern Alberta on the Picani Reserve.
Okay.
Where they had a sawmill for, they would harvest timber in the Porcupine Hills.
Oh yeah.
And then, but I don't remember the details precisely, but I'm quite certain that that sawmill was shut down, by the the Department of Indian Affairs. And these are, so during that time, these are all, like these policies have devastating effects.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think the big thing is that, this strategy that Indigenous peoples are trying to implement of transitioning their economies to, these new economies are, they're all undercut, and it really makes it in the end. Very few Indigenous peoples are able to be economically successful at that time.
Right.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. There's just a lot of hurdles in the way, and it's just, there's just no support. And yeah, so it's, so getting from there to today, how does that difficult time, like, let's talk about the reserves a little bit. So like, how did the formulation of reserves immediately start to affect Indigenous people, and then like, how does that carry on, and like, how did that continue to make it difficult for them to make a living and that kind of stuff? Like, and they're also their interpretation of what the reserve was going to be and where they're allowed to go, what they're allowed to do.
Yeah,
I think that's a big thing right now, right? Like, you see a lot of reserves that are failing really poorly, and like, there's a lot of people are having a hard time. And as a Western society, we're like, well, what the hell's going on? Like, why is this so bad?
Yeah.
Right. Like, I really don't know. Like, why is this so bad? Right. And you're like, okay. And you talk about residential schools and that kind of stuff, and I'm sure that plays a huge role. But I'm sure there's more before we get to that point.
Yeah, residential schools are huge, of course, because they leave a legacy of trauma, and when people are, suffering from trauma, life is just more difficult in general, right? And then it becomes difficult when you have such a trauma is so ever present in people's lives, because of course humans are resilient as well. We're able to overcome trauma, but when you pile it up, traumas after traumas, these things are very difficult to deal with. Certainly from an economic standpoint, their reserves aren't always well situated, and then, as I talked about, there's all these other factors that prevented people from joining kind of, emergent economies around agriculture.
Yeah.
And actually forestry at the time was also important. And
like, if you were an Indigenous person and you wanted to get into agriculture, did you have to do it on the reserve, or could you get land off the reserve to do agriculture and still hold on to your rights and that kind of stuff?
You could absolutely. Oh, actually,
if you don't know, it's okay.
You know what?
We don't need to say we don't know.
I'm not
for sure.
I'm thinking there would have been nothing that prevented you, but I'm actually not sure if Indigenous people could have bought property at that time.
Because there was a lot of that going on too, right? Like, I don't think Indigenous people were even allowed to, this is jumping around a lot, but they weren't even allowed to have legal counsel until like the 70s or something, right?
Yeah, so the legal counsel thing was something that was taken away in the 1920s when Indigenous people started to use the courts.
Yeah, so I didn't know that. Okay, yeah. So what was going on there? What was the?
I don't know exactly what it was, but I believe a lot of it was Indigenous people started to use the courts to sue for land rights and for different, what would be called like Aboriginal rights or treaty rights. So this is often rights to hunting and fishing.
Right. But their legal right to counsel was just taken away.
Mm-hmm. And part of that also too was, I think, people started to sue over the ability to undertake different cultural practices. So at that time, Indigenous peoples were banned from doing different religious ceremonies.
Right.
And so, I'm sure people saw ideas like freedom of religion and were saying, hey, what do you guys mean freedom of religion? You're not letting us do potlatches or sun dances or any of these other ceremonies that we do, right? And so, and then I think residential schools were also a huge part of that.
Yeah. Because
one of the things that happened in the 1920s is attendance at residential schools became compulsory.
Yeah.
And that didn't happen until the 1920s. And I believe that was also part of Indigenous people's turn to the courts. And then, as Indigenous people started turning to the courts, then I guess the simple move was to make it illegal to hire a lawyer.
Right.
And so, that would have hurt.
Well, yeah. No kidding. Oh, you want to fight this? No, you're not allowed.
Yeah. And so, but it's difficult to say what has put reserves in the situation we find them in today. It really is probably an accumulation of a huge amount of factors.
I've already described a lot of reasons why things would not go well.
Yeah. I think part of, though, what it is that for Indigenous peoples, it's the ability to not just have your society be based on like a single reserve community, but to be based on a linked set of communities, right? And so prior to the movement on reserves, you would have had like individual bands, but also those bands would have been linked through various measures, primarily through kinship, through people understanding how they're related to different people across the prairies.
Okay.
But the other way in which it was accomplished was through large summer gatherings and encampments, right? So you could have summer gatherings that would be thousands of people. And then as the winter came around and it became, more difficult to survive, to hunt, you would disperse into smaller communities, right? But these kind of seasonal aggregations and disaggregations, what it meant is that you were connected to and linked with lots of different people. And it meant that Indigenous peoples had these political economic orders which were spread across vast territories.
Right.
And so and not only just vast territories, but like distinct groups of people as well, right? You would have connections. It wouldn't just be like Cree people who were all connected. It would be, Cree people who are connected with various other nations, right? And people were, there wasn't many people who were fluent in English. People were usually multilingual in the ability to speak more than one language. So someone like Peter Erasmus, this whole book, I'm like, this guy speaks Cree, he speaks Michif, he speaks English. I'm like, but so what?
Who is this guy?
Yeah.
You just want to see a picture of him, probably. That's what it's gonna look like. Yeah.
And so, so I think to me, that's probably one of the less talked about legacies of reserves is that it really isolates Indigenous peoples, and it creates, and I think in some ways it actually creates an idea that your community itself should just be self-sufficient, when that was never really the case.
Okay.
People were always linked. If you had a bad year, let's say like berries in your area, the crop was bust one year, you could rely on your neighbors, right?
Even now, agriculturally, if you're running you're farming, whatever, and you have a bad year, like you depend on insurance and on the government to help get you out of that bad year. But meanwhile, Indigenous people were just left to their, like, well, if you fail, that's on you. It's kind of like, well, what? Like, yeah. That's interesting that you say that, though. The way you worded that, I like that, was that the reserve system, although it was seen as being like, oh, well, like this will help us prosper in some way, it went the other way, and it served to like isolate and kind of disconnect Indigenous peoples from the rest of society, and probably served to like further ingrain that social identity of being like, well, they're other than. You know what I mean?
And I don't think of it just as the linkages between reserves and the rest of Canada, but even different reserves' abilities to link with each other, right?
Oh, for sure. So, right. And, like you were saying, because they always get together. Yeah.
And so, one of the things, and for many decades, actually, there's even a policy where you need a pass to leave your reserve, so you don't even have freedom of movement.
Jesus.
And there, it was never actually like a full-on Canadian law, but it was just like a policy that some Indian agents enforced for decades.
They just do what they want.
Yeah, and so
it's a wild, wild west.
And so these, to me, the ability to like, to have maintained larger like conglomerations of like, Indigenous like political and economic power, I think that to me is probably one of the huge legacies of reserves. And then it gets compounded with, legacies of trauma, often created by residential school, initial difficulties around joining kind of emergent economies, which then just continue on in time for lots of people. These are all the things I think that the big ones that I think of when I think of like the difficulties facing reserves today.
Yeah, for sure. No, that totally makes sense. And for me, I feel like from what I gather from speaking to people is that like the residential schools, like that is the big the big thing that has prevented Indigenous peoples from prospering the way they should. Like, had that not happened, we might be looking at a bit of a different story, right? So like even for you, like personally, like how in your family and that kind of stuff, like I'm sure you must have some kind of connection to residential schools somewhere, and if you're cool with talking about that, like what's your personal experience with all that?
Yeah, so no, my kokum went to residential schools. My dad went to day schools, which were schools that were still administered by the federal government or by churches, although you weren't required to stay there. And actually, even I went to kindergarten at a day school.
Really?
Yeah.
Isn't that bananas? Look
So, you know, and I went to school in Wetaskiwin the next year. And then I was one of the last years where it was still operated by the federal government because Ermineskin took control of that school in the early 90s. But yeah, when I went to kindergarten, and it was 88, 89, something like that.
Yeah.
It was still operated by the federal government. And so, you know, these are things that they have an effect on everyone, right? And it's not just an effect on children. You know, one of the things that, so I've had a chance to listen to the co-commissioners of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission multiple times. And in fact, Wilton Littlechild was my next door neighbor growing up.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But this one comes actually from Marie Wilson. She was really good at explaining that residential schools didn't just have an effect on children; they had an effect on parents, right? Because you would be living your life without kids, and so you have communities where kids are just disappearing for most of the year, and that has an effect on the way in which adults behave. And I think she says that a lot of legacies of addictions actually come out of the fact that there was just no kids around, and people had one, it's the difficulty of like losing your kids for a long times of the year.
Forcibly so. Like early on, they were literally like, it was like you said, it was mandatory. They were taken, like people use the word kidnapped.
That's right.
From their homes and forced into these religious schools where they're tried to indoctrinate them into Canadian society and beat into them your culture is bad. It's the devil.
Yeah. But you can, one could see like how drinking might become a problem, in scenarios like that, right? And so, residential schools affected different families in different ways. And so, one of the things you hear about is that, some people say they liked residential schools, or residential schools gave them an opportunity for education. And I think, this is, in some cases, this is actually true. Like residential schools did provide an opportunity to become further educated. So like my grandmother, like my kokum, she got a teaching certificate at U of A, but she spent most of her, I think up until grade 9 or 10 in residential schools, right? Okay. But she did have success in residential schools. I think the thing is not that we should deny that some people didn't gain education in residential schools, but that on the whole, residential schools were awful for people, and the level of education was typically substandard. But of course, you're going to have some exceptional students who are going to, do well in residential schools and make something of it, right? Like that's just like part of human exceptionalism, right? Is some people are always going to make the best of their situation. But I think the bigger point is not that there were some good things and some bad things, but that Indigenous peoples need to be allowed to be in charge of how their stories are told.
Imagine today if we were just like, okay, every single child has to go to this Muslim school here in Alberta, right? Like you have to go to this Muslim school, you have to learn about being a Muslim and learn that Christianity and Catholicism and all that other stuff is horrible, it's hell, and your parents are basically Satan. Like imagine how that would impact. Like no, there would be riots and war. Like it would not be okay. So it's like, I can't imagine the impact that it has, right? And
it's individuals should be allowed to represent their own stories, right? So if,
of course.
If someone had a good experience, if an Indigenous person had a good experience in residential schools, I would never try to take that away from them or deny it.
Yeah.
I think the bigger question, or like the bigger point that I'm trying to make, is that for non-Indigenous peoples, when you try to understand residential schools, you can't take the story of a single individual and then blow it up to represent the experience of everyone.
Good point.
Right.
I like that.
And so that's why, when I say like Indigenous peoples need to have the ability to represent our own stories, what it means is that you have to listen to multiple people. And you have to get a bigger context and sense of what an experience with a particular institution, in this case, residential schools, what it meant for Indigenous peoples.
Yeah.
You can't just go cherry pick, your one Native friend who had a good experience and then say, well, I think all these other people are wrong because my buddy said that, his experience was good. Right.
Yeah.
And so I think to me, this is what comes down to, the willingness to have a relationship with Indigenous peoples, is that you can't just like pick one Indigenous person and then say they get to represent everyone. It's that you have to like deal with with a group, right?
Of course, so, there are people, and there's difference of opinion in all people. You can't just be like, oh, they all have the same perspective. They're all the same person. They're all, I get you.
Yeah. So and on that front, it's like overwhelming that Indigenous schools were something that were very, very difficult for for Indigenous communities.
Yeah. A lot of people that I spoke with whose, like mostly grandparents or parents had they talk about how their parents never ever talked about basically that like 15-year period of their life. Like never heard them talk about it ever. Right. And the assumption was that it was so traumatic that it was not something that you want to, it's like talking to a war veteran and be like, oh, how was World War II? It's like, there's a reason they're not talking about it.
That's right.
It's like, this has been, so it's a weird one to me that that's not something that's more common knowledge in this, you know what I mean? Like it only stopped 30 years ago and it's not something that we've, like I mean, I'm sure when you went, it probably like,
it was much different,
but it was much different, I'm sure, but
but it does put it in perspective that, I attended like a day school that was run by the federal government.
Yeah. That's kind of what it was. Yeah. So it changed over time, but like, the situation created there. It was never intended to help Indigenous people do well. Yeah. Let's put it that way, I guess.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So when we talk about like the current situation regarding Indigenous peoples today in Canada, especially, what is some of the major misconceptions that's like that's like holding people back, that like say, I'm trying to figure out, like, how do we help Indigenous people today, right? Like, there's been all this trauma, this history of injustice and miscommunication, and just a lot of times just plain racism in a lot of it, right? How do we get away from that history and start to help? You know what I mean? Start to include the full history of Canada into our understanding, so that we can, like you said before at the very beginning of this, treaties are supposed to be a good thing. Yeah. Right. This is a meeting of two peoples that we can work together and live together and prosper together on the land. And right now, by the signing of the treaties, settler groups like my ancestors and everything else have done really, really, really well. Continue to prosper, continue to get richer, to continue to just do well. And Indigenous people have continued to decline in their prosperity and their health and everything, right? So like clearly there's one side of the treaty here that is not being upheld, right? Yeah. So how do we start to make it so that this is something that's good for everybody, and not just like, well, we'll continue to prosper on the backs of you know what I mean, this situation?
Absolutely. Like obviously I think that there's immediate steps that we can take, as a country to deal with these issues. But on a bigger picture sense, I think it comes back to this idea of like, do treaties lie at the foundation of this country, or is it the doctrine of discovery? Right. Yes, okay. And to me,
nice wraparound, really.
Yeah, like that. To me, that's a question of, do we want this country to be founded on colonization, and what people often call today like settler colonization, right? Because colonization was something that typically ended, whereas settler colonization is you came to settle and stay. And, rather than join rather than join existing societies, you brought your own laws with you, right? Like that's what the process of settlement is, right? And this is like I use that term. That term is very controversial these days. Many people, many non-Indigenous peoples take offense to it, but I use it because it was it's a historically accurate term. That was a term that British people used.
It's not meant to be offensive. It's just
to describe themselves. Yeah. And so, I don't always use that term, but it's a historically factual term. And so, if we don't want to be a society built on settler colonization, but we want to be a society built on a treaty relationship, well, then we have to move ourselves that way, right? And how we do that is going to be really difficult. And so, I think one of the things I think about sometimes is we are a really wealthy society. And in fact, there's even, many many Indigenous peoples get to participate and benefit in the wealth of our society as well. Although many non-Indigenous peoples don't. And even for Indigenous peoples who are, who have done well for themselves economic or like financially, the fact of being Indigenous is that you're always related to and connected to people who struggle, right? Like that is just like no Indigenous person gets to escape that. Yeah. But at the same point, even though we're a wealthy society, scarcity is always a thing, right? And we're always challenged by questions of who gets what and how do we distribute resources and how do we generate them, but how do we distribute them, right? And in those questions, there's always winners and losers. And so, I think to some level, there does have to be some reckoning on the part of non-Indigenous people in this country of, okay, how do we make decisions where Indigenous peoples are going to benefit more, right? And like, there's no magic wand that can be waved. And like, right now, I could give you a 10-point bulletin of what I think needs to happen, but I don't think those things are necessarily helpful. I think the bigger issue is that non-Indigenous peoples need to really take on this idea of being a treaty partner with Indigenous peoples. Sure. And if you take this idea seriously, then I think that there's lots of things that flow from it in terms of how our society will change and look different.
Yeah. Right? Do we want to move forward having this history of hate and discrimination against Indigenous people, and be like, yeah, we're okay with that? Mm-hmm. Or do we want to move forward and just be like, hey, why don't we support this culture and try to, become better for it, right? Mm-hmm. Like ultimately, the more diverse of opinions you have, the stronger the country, right? Like you're just going to have more opportunity for different ideas and different perspectives. And like, so do we want to be proud of Indigenous people and allow them to be like a huge part of the future of this country, mm-hmm. and the way we, Or do we want to just continue to look back and be like, well, I mean, it's kind of their problem. Yeah. Right. So it's, yeah. Like, so it's a weird one too. Cause like we said at the very beginning, I could go my entire life without doing anything for Indigenous people and I would never know it. Uh-huh. Whereas Indigenous people, like the opposite isn't true, right? Like mm-hmm. they're dependent on, the mass majority of people are not Indigenous in the country, and like mm-hmm. without support, how are they? Yeah, mm-hmm. It's weird for me to hear people say stuff like, oh, they're given, they're given everything, like all the opportunity, all these handouts, and they just squander it or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. And you're like, okay, but what exactly are they given, first of all? Or how are they squandering it? And what is going on? Like, what is the context of this, right? Like, it's not, so it's sad when you hear a lot of that, right? You hear a lot of that stereotype and that discrimination. Yeah. But it's, I feel like we're moving away from it, but it still exists today in 2020. We're still dealing with this.
Yeah. I would never claim that, economic mismanagement doesn't happen within Indigenous nations, but economic mismanagement happens everywhere, right? Yeah. But when you deal with poverty, there's very difficult circumstances that are often placed on people, which cause them to act in ways where you try to preserve resources for yourself. But to me, the bigger question is not one of economic mismanagement. Some of that will happen sometimes, but for Indigenous peoples, there's a huge incentive to not economically mismanaged funds, because we're trying to create a bright future for ourselves as well, right? Like we don't want to be stuck in a situation where we're continually dependent, or that, you know, we're not successful in, you know, various areas of, like, you know, government and business and, you know, all of these areas. But at a certain level, you know, those things are all besides the point. Like at a certain level, it's, if you're really believe in a treaty relationship, then you believe that Indigenous peoples have political rights and that they have to be dealt with as such.
Right.
Right.
They're citizens, the same as everybody else.
Yeah. And you know, and that those political rights are distinct, and that there's certain, what flows from it is a political relationship that has to take place between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in the country. Yeah. And that we're still a long ways from working that out. And even though I think some days I am quite optimistic that we've set ourselves up on a path which could be productive moving into the future. At the end of the day, if we're on that path right now, we're just starting it, really, in lots of ways. Yeah. And, you know, it doesn't mean that we haven't had relationships for generations, you know, throughout the history of Canada, but that more often than not, the political rights that Indigenous peoples have as collectives have been dismissed by the rest of Canada.
It's as simple as that. Yeah. Like, just dismissed. It's not that they're actively like today. It's not like people are actively like oh, you know, fuck Indigenous people. It's just like they're just dismissing it and just like, well, I have this other problem. I have to worry about myself and my family and whatever. And we all do that. That's not. But just dismiss is a good word for it, because it's just kind of pushed aside.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And it's, you know, we all face conditions of scarcity. Like scarcity is something that we deal with as societies, but at the same point, we're also very privileged in lots of ways as well to live in Canada. And you know what? So what I would hope is that there's a real willingness to, you know, to share in all of those things. But for me, obviously there's concrete steps that we can take, but people have to go figure that out in their own situations based on the context that they're in. And if you're in a position where you're like, I have no clue what concrete steps I would take to do, that's probably because you haven't thought about it enough. Sure. So, you know, so one, you know, it's just that in general, we have to start putting more effort into thinking how Indigenous peoples are going to prosper in this country. But at a basic level, that there has to be a real willingness or recognition that there is a political relationship based on treaty, and that we have to become treaty partners if we're going to be able to tell the story in this country that we're proud of, I think.
And to this point, we haven't really been treaty partners, in your opinion. Like, it's just not the western end of the treaty hasn't been upheld.
No, it hasn't been. It has been in some ways. Like, there are Indigenous peoples are able to benefit from treaty rights in all sorts of different ways. But you know what? It has to be bigger than just Indigenous peoples getting some rights. It has to be about like what it means for you know, two different societies to get along with each other.
Yeah, right, right. I love that. That's a good way to put it, because these are, like you said, these are two different societies trying to coexist in an area together while both prosper. And to this point, only one part of one society has been prospering, and the other one not so much. So
yes,
there's an imbalance there for sure. Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah, but there was a couple other things, like the word, and I don't know if this is something that you feel comfortable speaking to or not, but when you listen to people, Indigenous people talk about today, a lot of people will use the words like reconciliation and like decolonization. Yeah. Right? Can you explain what they mean by that? Like what that, because decolonization almost sounds like, hey, get your shit and get out of here. Whereas like, but what do these words actually mean? And especially in context of like today. Yeah. Right? Like when someone's asking for reconciliation and decolonization, what does that mean?
Yeah. The way in which I take the term decolonization, because we live in a country where people are not going to like leave Canada and go back to Europe to Asia and Africa, and like all the, people have come from all over the world, right, to live in Canada. And so, in this context, decolonization is going to look different than it looked like in other parts of the world, where the decolonization movement meant that European powers gave up control over foreign territories and often left, right?
Right.
In the Canadian situation, what decolonization means is that you have to shift from becoming somebody who is a colonizer to somebody who is a treaty partner. And what
that mind shift, just that brain swap. Okay.
And it's, it has to be more than just a brain swap, because it has to probably at some level involve a change in the material reality of our country, so that, Indigenous peoples are able to, benefit in the same way as other peoples in Canada.
Yeah.
But, if being a colonizer is that, the foundation of the country is, settler colonization, then that's how I think of decolonization. Is you move from being founded on settlement and colonization to being founded on a treaty relationship. I
like that. Yeah. But that's so much better of a story.
Yeah.
To be like, hey, we came here. There was or whatever. Let's say the English came here, right?
Yeah.
And there was a bunch of shit that happened. It was bad. It was good, and it was whatever. And then we signed these treaties, and this is supposed to be this come together as a friendship agreement kind of thing. And let's be proud of this document and learn to live together and kind of support it in the true sense of what it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
That's so much better of a. It's just a better idea of Canada.
Yeah.
Than hey, we came here, took this is ours, and those people over there, they can do what they need to do, and it's fine, do your thing, whatever.
No, but if we want that to be the story that we tell, then we have to be able to live it. Yeah.
Totally.
Also too, yeah.
Yeah. And then it comes to the question, how do we live it, right? How do we, and I know you said you have your own opinions on how we, 10-point thing on how we do that, but how do we, what is the best way that a person today, a non-Indigenous person today, or even an Indigenous person, that they can support that idea, that reality that we want to try to accomplish?
It's interesting. I was talking with one of my friends about, saying that you're for decolonization. And, when I explain it, it's moving from from a position of being a settler or a colonizer to being a treaty partner, I think a lot of non-Indigenous peoples are ready and willing to make that jump, but it's not like voting. It's not, you can't go, mark a checkbox off. And I think sometimes that's the impulse is sign me up. I'm on.
Yes,
I'm on
for
board.
This.
I am for this. Yeah.
Yeah.
Where's the form?
Yeah.
And but unfortunately, that's not the situation. Decolonization, I talk about it more as being a craft or a practice.
Okay.
And you have to be able to build out your skill set in terms of being somebody who practices decolonization as well as just being committed to it, right? Yeah. And building out that skill set is actually quite hard because we don't have a lot of tools which have helped people build it out. And this is more so true of non-Indigenous peoples, but it's also true of Indigenous peoples to some extent, where we are so constantly under duress and under a difficult situation. It actually can be quite hard to imagine what a decolonized future looks like. And in fact, for me, sometimes it's actually impossible to imagine what it looks like as well. But that's because it's hard to practice in the present, right? Because you're almost sometimes so used to having to, fight for every single little thing.
Yeah.
But I think the bigger goal is that it's a craft, and you have to work on it. You have to build it out. And then, like all crafts, as you put your time and your energy into it, you become more comfortable with it, and you become more skilled and adept at doing it over time. I think also a craft, it means that you have to keep working at it. It's not something that you ever, you can ever just let fade away. Like,
Yeah.
it's not like riding a bike. Like once you know how to do it, you're good. You don't have to think about it anymore.
Yeah.
It's, it's a practice that you have to keep up at, and that you have to, keep moving to be able to implement it. It's something that you have to constantly kind of be aware of and
continue
to work
your competence.
Yes.
Kind of like a professional thing.
Yeah. Absolutely. And so very interestingly, like the competence and professional thing, that's how Naomi Metallic, who's the director of the Indigenous Law Program at Dalhousie out in Halifax, that's how she describes Indigenous law. She's like, you're not learning about Indigenous law as part of, for a social justice purpose, or to out of like the goodness of your heart. You're learning about Indigenous law because you can't be a competent lawyer unless you have a basic understanding of what Indigenous law means.
Right.
Yeah. So, I think there's even for professional associations, there actually is, that has to actually just be part of it too. But that, to me, that's part of the bigger craft of decolonization in this country, is there, at some level, there does have to be increased training of how we understand these issues in relation to different people's professions.
Oh, for sure. Well, yeah. Dude, I feel like I've been paying a lot of attention like the last few years of my life, where I've started to pay more attention to Indigenous stuff that's going on. Right.
Yeah.
And the word decolonization, when I first hear it, I'm like, that rubs me the wrong way. I'm like, what the hell does that mean? Mm-hmm. Right? Like, kind of like, I get the picture of like, pick up your shit and go back to England or whatever, right? And that's not what it means.
You're getting on one of those old timey boats with sails, and you're like, this is bullshit. Like, why can't I take a plane?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it's like I think that's the idea that a lot of people get. Right? They're like, oh, they're telling us to leave Canada. It's like, no. We're just saying like, hey, can we change the way can we do what we agreed to do? Mm-hmm. That's basically all we're saying. We agree what we agreed to do, because we haven't been doing that so far. We've been taken advantage of and not like, it's so, it's funny. Right? I just see the word like decolonization, like blowing up on Twitter as like just this crazy, you know what I mean? Like just being like this troll thing or whatever, right? Like I could just seeing it being just a dogfight on Twitter.
Well,
kind of thing.
And reconciliation is the other big word as well. And in fact, reconciliation has much more usage in terms of like a conventional and a mainstream sense. It's something we hear about often in the present. A lot of that, I think, was because of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission,
right?
And it had, the release of that final report had this gravitational pull on Canadian consciousness that I'm not sure anything else has had that pull. Like the TRC final report. And, I think part of that was people coming to terms and confronting the horrors of residential schools in a lot of ways. And it was just very shocking for people. And I think it allowed people to maybe understand in a different way, connect the situation that Indigenous peoples that we find ourselves in today with the fact that there's, historical reasons that have led to this situation, right? Yeah. And so, reconciliation, I think reconciliation has been useful in the fact that it's opened up a space to talk about stuff, but just when we open up space to talk about something, we could just fill it back in with all our old habits, right? So reconciliation in and of itself doesn't do anything. It's only a matter of whether or not we use that space that's been opened up, and what is, people have given it a little bit of their bandwidth now, right? Like like Indigenous issues now are something that people are willing to take the time to learn about and to talk about more. But it can't just be all talk, right?
Yeah.
And so
how do we put this to paper, right?
Yeah.
How do we make this something real?
Yeah. And so, we're still waiting to find out what the impact of reconciliation will be as a historical moment, I would say. And to what extent that, that space that's opened up will stick around and will then be able to make an impact moving forward. And so, there's lots of, I think, fantastic Indigenous intellectuals who have provided these critiques of reconciliation that we might be aware of, right? So like, like, what is the word reconcile? Like, one of it is like a bank ledger, right? Like it's, to reconcile accounts, right? And so if that's the way in which people approach it, that's probably not a good idea, because I think the danger is that we'll just say, okay, we have all this historical injustice, let's go solve it and then leave the past behind us, and then we'll continue on as Canada, right? But I think one of the things that Indigenous peoples are saying is, to continue on as Canada means that we have to have a treaty relationship.
Right.
And that means an ongoing relationship. So it's not something we can leave in the past. It's actually, in a way, we have to look to the past even more and to really be
true with ourselves, right?
Yeah.
Like that's the one thing that a lot of people get upset about and talk about. Well, we can't forget the past. Like we can't take down these statues. We can't ignore the past. And it's like, well, we're not forgetting the past. We're bringing to light the true past of what actually happened, and let's appreciate everything for what it actually is, and not what the government at the time decided we should know about, kind of thing, right?
Yeah. No, when the John A. McDonald statue comes around, I'm like, won't forget about that guy. I promise. He did some pretty bad things. I will remember.
We're going to remember. It's not going anywhere. Yeah.
So that's one of the things with reconciliation, and then of course even this idea of reconciling a past is to relegate something to the past as well, and to not believe that we're still dealing with injustices in our present. And so, there's reasons to be suspicious of the term reconciliation, but I do think in a real sense that it has created space to talk about these issues. But that, we're nowhere close to knowing how it's going to turn out.
For sure.
Yeah.
I like the way you put it. I don't know if you said this or if I thought this in my mind after you supported it. Was it's in a way we have to redefine Canada, right? Redefine what we mean by Canada, and start to identify with Indigenous culture a little more, and just start to just be supportive of it instead of just dismissive, like you had said earlier, right? Like let's allow Indigenous peoples and Indigenous culture to be something we can be proud of, and a part of this culture that we can continue, or you can start to support. And you know what I mean? And be something to be happy about and work together. And it's just a better story, right? But but we're afraid of letting go of the past. I don't know what the hell, but it's a crazy conversation to even try and have, right? Because we just talked for almost 2 hours, and I still feel like I know a lot more than I did before going into this conversation, but I still have it's still where do we go from here? Like, how do we do this? Right. It's just such a hard question to solve. It's just, it seems never ending. Right. But in all hopefully we'll continue to move down that path and have conversations like this, I guess, is all you can really do. Right. Just continue to have conversations and try to make it the norm. I guess with any social movement, right? That's all it is, really. You just keep doing it until you can't ignore it anymore. Yeah. Well, change is interesting because it's hard to see it when it's happening, right? It's only easier to spot in retrospect. And so, I think it's real easy to believe and to feel that we're this kind of monolith that is incapable of changing. But of course, we know that, that's not true. Like, history is full of changes, right? Yeah. And so, at some point we have to believe in ourselves to be able to make those changes. But part of that means that, all of these old habits we have to think about and to approach this issue has to be, we have to reevaluate them and decide what can stay and what has to go. And probably a lot of things are going to have to go. Yeah. And it's, being able to replace that with an understanding of what a treaty relationship is going to look like. Yeah, for sure. That makes sense. Just not continuing to do things because it's how we've done things. Just don't need to be afraid of change, like you said, right? Change is good. It's happening all the time. Let's just support it and know that that's a good thing, right? For sure. So yeah, this is awesome, man. Well, this is a good conversation. Sweet. I didn't know where we were going to go, but it went a fun place anyways. Nice. For me, I learned a lot. So thanks a lot for doing this. Cool. Thanks a lot for listening, guys. I loved that conversation. It was just awesome for me. Learned so much, and I'm so thankful that Matt took the time to come on and have this conversation. And I hope you guys learned some stuff. I know I did. I'm continuing to, be on this journey of learning everything. And this is one of those things that I want to learn more about. To just, so I don't get into conversations and situations where I don't know what I'm talking about. It's good to have the context and to not be mistaken on situations as serious as how Canada came to be and what a treaty is, right? How we're supposed to live together harmoniously so everyone can prosper. It's just a good story. Why not tell that story, right? So yeah, thanks a lot for listening, guys. Shoot me an email, yourforestpodcast@gmail.com. I'll get back to you, and make sure to rate and review, tell your friends, share it on social media, all that good stuff. This podcast is everywhere. Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, all that stuff. Thanks a lot, guys. We'll catch you next time. Take it easy.